Well, once again, we're on the move, transitioning this time from pi slice 2 to pi slice 3, from our second major family of religion to the third, and to the third and last group of historical religions. Remember that distinction I've made before. These are religions with more or less datable origins in the historical record. Here I remind you once more of what our pi looks like when it's placed on top of a map of the world. And then here, a bit closer up, are some of the countries one would travel to and through on one's way west toward Europe and the Americas. You see China over there on the right where we've been, and then coming across the map, Europe pointing off in the west, northwesterly direction. What's in a name? What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. As I recall, that was Juliet talking to Romeo in Shakespeare's play as they reflected on the differences between their families' names, the Montagues and the Capulets. But of course, here what I'm talking about are the different ways in which we can describe the Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Geographically speaking, yes, they are west, although, as I've said, geography is pretty relative, actually, depending on where you start in the world. We also call them, as you know from the reading, the Semitic religions. That's a term that comes from the Old Testament name Shem, one of the sons of Noah. We could call them Abrahamic religions, after the name of the patriarch Abraham. But for our purposes here, right, the most important term that we could use to describe this family is monotheistic. These are the monotheistic religions inasmuch as they believe in only one deity, a deity who is at once transcendent and immanent. Remember this diagram, Conceptions of the Divine, and how we've placed monotheism in the center, as it were, as a kind of balancing act. The monotheistic understanding of God is that God is indeed beyond the world, and yet he created the world and cares for the world and shows concern for this world. So monotheism right smack in the middle of kinds of conceptions of God. Here's our diagram from some time ago of going back to these little diagrams of stars and then semicircular green blobs representing the world. And my star, the single star, again shows that Jews, Christians, Muslims believe in only one God, who nonetheless radiates down visually in terms of those arrows toward the world that he cares for and that he created. The Western religions, Abrahamic, Semitic, monotheistic religions, are also, we could say, exclusivistic religions. Notice my asterisk. Because of the fact that they emerged in a single part of the world primarily, there's a kind of, you almost could call it sibling rivalry between Jews and Christians and Muslims. They all place a big stress, a big emphasis on what I've called here historicity and particularity, the importance of history, the importance of particular events in the past as definitive for each of these religions in question. Certain places as well, where they believe that God has acted in a special, maybe miraculous way. Just some examples here of what I mean when I say that. For Jews, for Judaism, the Passover, of course, is crucially important in Jewish history. This is the event when God rescued the Jewish people, the people of Israel, from their bondage in Egypt. Many of you know the story, I'm sure. The Egyptian Pharaoh had refused to free the Jews. The Bible says his heart had been hardened. And when he continued to refuse, God began sending a series of plagues on Egypt, the last of which was that the firstborn of every Egyptian family would be killed. But before carrying out the punishment, God told the Jews to spread the blood of a sacrificed lamb over the doors of their houses, and that would signal the angel of death to pass over that house and protect its inhabitants. Well, that's where the idea of Passover comes from. And the Jews celebrate this particular rescue operation every year when they celebrate Passover in the spring. So that's a crucial, important historical event for the Jew. The Christian, coming across the slide, the Annunciation. Do you know that term? The Annunciation refers to the moment when the Archangel Gabriel came to the Virgin Mary and told her that she would conceive and bear God's son. That's the Annunciation, obviously a key moment for Christians. In Islam, the Laylat al-Qadr, that's the Arabic phrase on the right there. Laylat al-Qadr, that means the night of power, or the night of authority. And this was the night, Muslims say, when the Prophet Muhammad first began receiving revelations from God. We'll talk about that more in detail later on. As far as places go, for the Jews, Mount Sinai is crucially important. That's the place that Moses encountered God and where he received the law from God. For Christians, Golgotha. Do you know that term? Golgotha means the place of the skull, and it was the name of the hillside outside of Jerusalem where Christ was crucified. In Islam, the Kaaba would be a crucial place. We'll talk about that again more later in detail. The Kaaba is a stone structure in the city of Mecca, which is believed to have been sacred to Allah, to the Muslim God from time immemorial. So the fact that they have different events, different places, every event can't be the same as every other event by definition. They're different places on the timeline. Different places exclude each other, again by definition. You can't be in two places simultaneously. And those differences, but nonetheless the importance of those differences for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, again, means that they tend to be sort of exclusivistic and sort of like siblings rivaling each other and a bit envious of each other and so on. Well, we've categorized, talked about, described the historical religions, the first three families, right? South Asia, East Asia, and now in the West, as problem solvers, specializing, as it were, in addressing, trying to solve certain big philosophical problems. In the case of South Asia, of course, it was self, who am I? East Asia, society, who are you? Who's my neighbor? How do I relate to my neighbor? And now in the West, it's nature. It's trying to figure out to understand this creation around us. The Jew, the Christian, the Muslim all believe God made this world, created this world. And that implies that the world has some kind of significance, importance, that we need to dig into and try to understand in the West. This slide is meant to recapitulate, but also to express things in a slightly different way from what you've read. So follow my red, orangish red arrows coming down vertically down the screen between theology at the top and cosmology at the bottom. Theology is what you think about God. Cosmology is what you say or what you think or what you believe about the world, about the cosmos. Well, the point of the arrows is just to say, to remind you what I said in Paths of Return, how you understand God has very important implications for how you view the world. Your theology and your cosmology go hand in hand. Well, in the West, the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim all believe God is both a creator and artist and a ruler and king. We've said that. Well, if he's a creator, if he's the artist of the world, if he fashioned the world as an architect might fashion a building, that implies that the world must be real. It must be good. It must have a kind of intrinsic significance. We should take it seriously as something God made. Similarly, if God is construed, pictured as a ruler, a king, a cosmic emperor, well, that must mean that he does in fact care for and that he attributes importance to time itself. Time has a kind of linear quality, a unidirectional quality in the West, among the Western religions, because the idea here is that God set things up, he's guiding things along the way, he has a purpose in mind, a destiny in mind, a goal that he's seeking, and time is sort of moving in accordance with that purposiveness of God. So theology, cosmology go hand in hand, and that's how they look in the West, I guess you could say, in summary. Well, here I've got a image, a picture, a detail from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this painting before, Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam. And it's an image that underscores again how the West views creation. There's God on the right, I guess, the bearded guy. And then over there on the left, touching the finger of the guy on the left, well, that's Adam. He's looking very pumped up and very healthy and fit and pretty solid. So the solidity, as it were, the muscles, in fact, themselves on Adam sort of signify visually the significance, the importance, the weight, as it were, of creation. God made it, and again, we need to take it seriously. All right, let's focus in on the particular religion that I talked about for today in Paths of Return, namely Judaism. We're going to be spending just this one time on Judaism before we go on the next time to spend a few more sessions on Islam. Judaism, as usual, here to open things up, I give you just a little statistics about Judaism. It's the smallest of the world's religions, demographically speaking. Only 16 million followers worldwide. And I say here, around the same population of one city in India. Mumbai, a city in India, has about that many people. So it's very, very small, statistically speaking, which is not to say by any means it's unimportant. Jews have had an extraordinary impact on history, culture, religion, quite out of proportion to their relatively small numbers. I say here the Jewish population in Israel is about 6 million, so more Jews in the state of Israel than anywhere else in the world. I guess that's not too surprising. But notice followed very closely by the United States with around 5.7 million. No other country has a Jewish citizenry even approaching 1 million. So small population. Notice fewer than half of the Jews in the world actually live in Israel. Most of them are scattered in other parts of the world. I'm going to say something about that momentarily. The symbol here in the center of the screen, that's called the Star of David. Again, I'm sure some of you have seen that before. Two interlocking triangles. It's probably the most common symbol of Judaism, at least today. David was the Old Testament figure. King David reigned in the 11th and 10th century BC, led the Israelite people into victory in many battles, and is said to have inscribed this particular symbol on his shield as he went into battle. Actually, the state of Israel, that very sign, that Star of David, is on the flag of the state of Israel. Well, I mentioned the fact that Jews are scattered throughout the whole world. We call this the Diaspora. The diaspora is any dispersion of a people from a particular ethnic group outside of their original or ancestral homeland. But it's a term used in particular reference to Jews and their dispersion throughout the world. Anyway, I'm using the term here on this map to explain why, rather than giving Judaism a particular color, the people who created the map have instead used a symbol. In fact, it's a little Star of David. Do you see down here next to Judaism? That's a Star of David right there. And then what they've done is place that symbol in different parts of the world to show significant Jewish populations. So obviously here in Israel, and then we've got up in Eastern Europe, and then in Europe some populations of Jews. New York, New England, Miami, Florida, and then on the West Coast, significant populations of Jews in diaspora, again having been scattered in different parts of the world. Judaism, as you already know, oldest of the Western religions by far, right? The second oldest being Christianity, coming along almost 2,000 years later. If we were to date Judaism from the time of the patriarch Abraham, he was born probably, speculatively, at least about 1,800 years before Christ. Judaism, we've said, is the religion of a particular people, a particular ethnic group, similar in that respect to Hinduism. The word Judaism comes from, again, an Old Testament figure, Judah, who was one of the sons of Jacob. From Judah's name, we get Judaism, we get the country of Judea. The term Jew comes from this also, obviously. Like Hinduism, right? Hinduism had to do with the religion and the people and the culture of the Indus River Valley in India. So both of these religions being very much defined by historically and even named after particular things, particular people, or a particular place. I didn't mention in Paths of Return the different what we could call them denominations or branches of Judaism, namely the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Reform. Just a few words about that. Orthodox Jews are those who maintain the most traditional beliefs and practices of the religion. They follow special dietary laws, laws that you find in the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible, what the Christian calls the Old Testament. special rules that they follow, they keep concerning the proper observance of the Sabbath. So the most traditional of all Jews are the Orthodox. Reform Judaism, I'll go to the third branch here first. Reform Judaism began in the 19th century as a movement designed to bring Judaism more into line with, well, I guess I could say the modernizing ideas of the European Enlightenment. Reform Jews tend to focus more on ethics, and they tend to downplay and maybe even abandon, not keep at all, certain traditional beliefs and ritual practices of Judaism. Conservative Jews are kind of a balancing act. They also began in the 19th century kind of in reaction to Reform Judaism. As conservative Jews see it, Reform Judaism is too liberal and it's too radical, basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as we say, dropping too much of what's vital to the Jewish religion. So conservative Jews sort of situate themselves in the middle between Orthodox and Reform. Now, this division, a few more words about that here quickly. This division between denominations of Jews, it's totally different, really, from the other intra-religious divisions we've touched on before. So Vaishnavites, Shaivites, Shaktas, remember those groups? They're all traditional Hindus. Theravada, Mahayana Buddhists are both authentic forms of Buddhism. The three schools within Taoism that we talked about, philosophical, religious, and yogic, they're all very ancient, and they're all equally Taoist. But in the case of Judaism, in this case, the variations in question are really more a result of the fact that a significant number of Jews in the modern world have been willing to compromise with that world and to drop or abandon some of their traditional beliefs. And I mention this partly in this context because in this country, in the United States, if you actually look at the stats, the Reform Jews are the biggest number of Jews in the U.S., 41%, at least according to this diagram. Second largest number are the conservative Jews, and then the fewest are the Orthodox. Only 12% are fully traditional in keeping the full understanding of God and what the human being is and the commandments of God and so forth. I think the 18%, by the way, the other in this diagram refers to what we call secular Jews. So in other words, Jews who continue to identify themselves in terms of ethnicity as Jewish, but they've basically dropped religious practice altogether. Now, I need to be careful here. I don't want to mislead you. Jews are by no means unique in having their faith eroded by the Enlightenment and modern scientific claims and so forth concerning what we can know and the nature of the human being. I'm thinking all the way back to my opening talk in the class about science and religion and how there are two conflicting worldviews, going on there. All the religions have been affected by that. It certainly has occurred among many Christians. There are some denominations of mainline Protestants. I guess the shorthand here is simply to call them liberals, in which many of the people who still call themselves Christians no longer believe in Christ's virgin birth or in the resurrection, and who no longer follow the traditional moral rules of the faith. So the liberal-conservative divide, if I could put it that way, has affected certainly all the religions. But I wanted to mention it specifically here in connection with Judaism, again, precisely because in the United States, at least, the biggest number of Jews are those that have been most deeply impacted by modern thinking and modern ways of understanding things. But coming back to the center here, what I'm focusing on, as always, with all the religions we're studying, is the most traditional form. I want to give you a sense of what makes each of these religions distinctive in their view of God and the human being and so on. And so it makes the best sense, at least as I see it, to stick with the way in which the traditional Hindu, the traditional Buddhist, the traditional Jew, the traditional Muslim understand their tradition. So as we go on here now, I'm circling back to the Orthodox form, the most traditional of all of the forms of Judaism. There are, according to the Orthodox, 13 precepts, principles, beliefs, I guess you could say, in the Jewish creed. And these go back to a medieval, very important medieval figure, philosopher, sage, Moses Maimonides, 12th and 13th century AD. And he sums up Jewish faith, again, Orthodox Jewish faith, in 13 points. An Orthodox Jew has to believe there is God. God exists. God is one. We'll talk more about that momentarily. God is incorporeal. God has no body. He's eternal, beyond time, alone the object of worship. He reveals himself through the prophets. Among those prophets, Moses, according to the Orthodox Jew was preeminent. God gave the Torah, the law, to Moses on Sinai. And that Torah, that law, is immutable. It does not change according to age or culture or something like that. It's unchanging. I'll say more about Torah here in a second. The Orthodox Jew believe God knows everything before it's happened. God's foreknowledge is stressed. He rewards the good. He punishes the evil. The Orthodox Jew believes in a coming Messiah. I'll say more about that as I did in Paths of Return momentarily. And the Orthodox Jew believes in the resurrection of the dead. Torah, a note on Torah I say here. The word itself in Hebrew means, among other things, law, guidance, or teaching. And I compare that in parentheses here to the Sanskrit term dharma. So we talked about Hindus and Buddhists both talking about dharma, which is also law or tradition or guidance or instruction in those religions. The Chinese equivalent here is the term jiao. Do you remember I used that term in connection with Confucianism? I said that the Confucian doesn't call his religion Confucianism. He calls it Li Jiao. Li having to do with etiquette, comportment, and Jiao meaning something again like guidance, instruction, education, teaching, or law. So the Hebrew Torah, the Sanskrit Dharma, the Chinese Jiao, much the same thing in these traditions. All right, Torah has a specific and a generic meaning, you could say, for the Jew. More specifically, it refers to what they call the 5 books of Moses, the term Pentateuch. Do you see that word there? Pentateuch. Literally, it means 5 scrolls, but they call them the 5 books of Moses. And these are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, first 5 books also of what the Christian calls the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So if you say you're studying Torah, if you're a Jew and you're studying Torah, it's probably more precisely those books and the laws they contain that you're studying. But Torah also has a larger, more comprehensive, I call it generic meaning, where it refers to the whole Bible, the whole of the Jewish Bible, which is also called by the Jew Tanakh. Do you see that word? Tanakh, Tanakh. That's, now what's the word here? An acrostic, I think is the word. An acrostic is a word, the letters of which are the first letters of other words. I think that's correct. Anyway, Tanakh is a kind of abbreviation. The T is from Torah. Torah in the specific sense as referring to the 5 books of Moses. So that's part of the Jewish Bible. But Tanakh includes also the N is Nevi'im in Hebrew, which means prophets. And the prophets would include Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth. So when Christ, by the way, in the New Testament speaks of the law and the prophets, he's speaking about the Pentateuch specifically, and then the Nevi'im, the prophets. But then the third part of the Bible, the K letter, comes down to the Hebrew word ketuvim. And ketuvim means writings, and the writings include books like the Psalms, Proverbs, the book of Job, the Song of Songs, and so forth. So the whole Bible, the whole of the Old Testament, a Christian would call it, is Tanakh, and you could, as a Jew, also refer to the whole thing as Torah. So law, guidance, teaching, specifically the Pentateuch, but more expansively the whole Bible, that's Torah. All right, I talked about, in Paths of Return, 4 Jewish essentials. Let's go over those, review those, and elaborate just a couple of points, as I usually do. Unity, gifts, demands, patience. The essentials of the faith when it comes to understanding, for a Jew, God's relation to human beings. First of all, unity. Unity can be traced back above all to this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It's called the Shema from the first word of the Hebrew. Here is Shema in Hebrew. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Oneness, unity, has a couple of meanings for the Jew. On the one hand, it means there ain't nothing like God. God is unique. He's one of a kind. Maybe there are other sort of semi-gods, demigods, other suprahuman beings, but they're not on the same level as God, the Jew says. Hence, monotheism versus polytheism. God says, I guess I could put it this way, even if there are other gods, you shouldn't put them before me. "Thou shalt have no other gods except me," God says in Exodus. So uniqueness, one of a kind. It also, for the Jew, means that God is inwardly one. God does not have, as it were, parts on the inside. He's simple or undifferentiated. And this, obviously, naturally, logically, places the Jew over against the Christian, who does believe that God, in a sense, has parts. Now, a Christian really wouldn't put it that way, but that's how it looks to the Jew for sure. When the Christian says there's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, comprising a Trinity, well, the Jew goes, well, that can't be the case. God is one. He's not three. Trinity doesn't make any sense for the Jew. So God's unity, no polytheism, no Trinitarianism for a traditional Orthodox Jew. Then there are the gifts of God. And I distinguish between, on the one hand, creation, God makes the world, and on the other hand, his care for that world. Unlike a deist understanding of God, who gets things wound up, creates the world, and then steps back and remains a kind of aloofness with respect to the world. The Jew, well, like the Christian and Muslim, believes God gets his hands dirty. He stays involved. He shows his care for the world. Under creation, I put there's no demiurge. I mentioned this briefly, I think, in Paths of Return. Some traditions, some philosophies, like Plato's philosophy, says the high God, the supreme God, doesn't actually directly get involved in creation, but assigns that task to a sub-divine being called the demiurge. So the Jew says no demiurge. No, God does it directly. Also for the Jew, no distinction like that the Hindus would make between Brahman and Brahma. Remember that, right? Brahman, the supreme reality, and then Brahma is the creative deity, one of the three gods of the Trimurti, who manifests Brahman, and then Brahma takes upon himself the role of creation. Well, there's no distinction like that between Brahman and Brahma for the Jew. It's just God. Under providential care, I've reminded you that care is both universal, so God shows his concern for all creatures he's made, all the birds and the fishes and the land animals, they're all under his care and his providence. But he shows particular care for that particular creature that he made in God, in his own image and likeness, and that, of course, is the human being. Particular concern for men and women. I drew an arrow there from particular down to my box, where I put miracles, like the miraculous parting of the Red Sea and the freeing of the people from their bondage in Egypt. And then I wrote, whoever makes the rules can break the rules. Jews and Christians and Muslims, all three, believe that God intervenes and upsets the balance of natural law on occasion, does things that nature on herself would not do, precisely in order to exhibit and exert his care for his creatures. When things get messed up to a certain point, he comes in and kind of reorganizes things and refashions things, and that's what a Jew would certainly call a miracle. Then the demands. I said that Judaism is very different from all of the Asian religions we've looked at in both South and East Asia, in that it pictures God as a personal being who is willing to engage in interpersonal relationships with his human creatures. He's willing to set up a contract with them, what a Jew would call covenant. A contract, any kind of contract, right, says you do your part and I'll do my part, and we both sign off on this thing, and we're responsible in a sense to each other. Well, that's how the Jew pictures God's relation to man. He has engaged in a contract with man. And that contract on our side, on the human side of the ledger, obliges us to at least two things: worshiping him, worshiping God, and then exhibiting righteousness and justice in our behaviors toward each other. Worship can be seen, how the Jew understands God's demand that we worship him, can be seen in the first four of the Ten Commandments. If you're unfamiliar with these, take a look at the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. And these are where the famous Ten Commandments are given by God to Moses on Sinai. And then this last six of the Ten Commandments have to do with interpersonal relationship with each other, righteousness, justice, honoring one's neighbor as a creature of God. I wanted to expand here for just a little bit on the commandment which says you should honor God by honoring his name. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain is one of the commandments. And honoring God's holiness includes honoring his name according to Judaism. Let me expand on that. The Jew knows that the Ten Commandments include the statement that I've already quoted: thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. As I said in Paths of Return, this is not a prohibition, just sort of a generic prohibition against whatever bad language or cussing or swearing or something. It has to do very specifically with honoring the name, not just any given name, but the name which God gives to himself. When Moses, earlier on in the book of Exodus, asks God, "Who are you anyway? Who should I tell people has sent me when I get back down the mountain?" God says to Moses in Exodus 3:14, "I am who I am." And he said, "You tell the people of Israel this: I am has sent me to you." All right, so what is the name that we should not take in vain? It's the name that God gave to himself. Now, I am is obviously English. It's an English attempt to translate into English a Hebrew word, which you see on your screen here. Hebrew, like Arabic, reads from right to left. So we start over here. This is the Hebrew letter Yod, it's called. Then the Hebrew letter, this whole thing here is the letter He. And then the third letter is Vav, and then another He. So there are four letters here, four consonants: Yod, He, Vav, He. Well, we have to flip it around to read it from our left to right in English. The Yod is our Y, the He is our H. The Vav is variously transliterated into English as both a V sometimes and sometimes a W. And then again, the last He is again an H. So there are four consonants here: Y, H, V or W, and H. People have tried to sound this out. There are no vowels in that name in Hebrew you see here. I'll say more about that in a second. There are actually no vowels there. But people have speculated and tried to sound this thing out by inserting the vowels that you see on the screen here, an A and an E. And then it would sound something like maybe Yahweh or Yahweh. This is actually where the English word Jehovah comes from. There are the Jehovah's Witnesses, and people talk about the Old Testament God as Jehovah God. Actually, Yod, He, Vav, He, however you say that, could also be translated into English as He is. It's actually, grammatically speaking, a third-person singular form of the Hebrew verb to be. So literally it means he is. So God says to Moses, basically what God is saying to Moses here is, you want to know who I am? I'm the one who is. I'm existence itself. I'm pure being, about which nothing else can be said. I am just what I am. Don't try to predicate anything else of me, attribute anything else to me. I am just what I am. Now, back to the commandment. Here's why I'm talking about all this stuff now. Holiness requires, worshiping God requires respecting the holiness of his name. Don't take that name in vain. Don't carelessly use that name. Be careful when you come to that name? Well, here's what happened. Beginning in the 3rd century BC, the name of God came to be regarded by Jews as what we call a nomen ineffabile. That means a name unspeakable, an unspeakable name, a name you really ought not to say, a name you ought not even to try to pronounce, lest you in some way violate the commandment to be careful and cautious and not take it in vain. Here's what happened. The name began to be spoken at that point, 3rd century BC, only by the high priest of the temple. Only he would speak it aloud. And he would do so only in the Holy of Holies, which is the holiest part of the temple, and only one day a year, on the festival that the Jews call Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. But then what happened historically? The temple was itself destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So there's no longer a temple, no longer a Holy of Holies, no longer a Jewish priesthood, and no longer does anybody actually pronounce the name at all ever. And what happened, apparently, is that the actual pronunciation was lost. Now, again, you might say to yourself, if you haven't quite followed me here, well, wait a minute, the Hebrew letters are there, just sound them out. But the thing is, you can't sound them out, because in biblical Hebrew, only the consonants of words are actually written down, and you have to insert other vowels to pronounce it. And we don't know what the vowels were, because the pronunciation has been lost with the destruction of the temple. To complicate matters, and I'm about to stop this, I realize this is a rather long parenthesis, but to complicate matters, beginning in the Middle Ages, Jewish scribes started writing those 4 letters that you see on the screen. They're actually called the Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton means 4 letters. And the 4 letters are Yod, He, Vav, He. So the Jews talk about the Tetragrammaton. It's an unpronounceable name. It's a name you ought not to pronounce, okay? And the scholars began inserting vowels between the consonants, which would actually be the vowels used in the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord. So every time a Jew would come to the Tetragrammaton in the scripture, he would simply say Adonai in order to be careful not to take the actual name in vain. And what you find in most English translations is that Adonai is rendered by the word Lord in English in all caps, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Whenever you see that, if you're ever reading the Bible, you come across that, you'll know, well, that's one of the places in the original Hebrew where God's own name was used. And the Jew is being very careful not to take it in vain. I might say here finally, too, the Tetragrammaton is the name of God in the Hebrew Bible that's used most frequently. I'm looking at my notes here. 6,823 times the Tetragrammaton occurs in the Hebrew Bible, but you never say it. You don't pronounce it. I say at the bottom of the screen here, there's obviously for the Jew no mantrayana. Mantrayana is using a mantra, like Ram, like Swami Ramdas. There's no Nimbutsu in Judaism. Nimbutsu was the Buddhist equivalent among Pure Land Buddhists, where they would invoke the Buddha Amitabha and again repeat and repeat and repeat his name. Well, you can't repeat the name of God in Judaism because you can't even say it once. You shouldn't at least say it once. It's too dangerous. All right, a long excursus. Back to the 4 aspects of God that we're speaking of here. The final one, the 4th one, God's patience. And I divided that up into 3 different aspects in Paths of Return. God exhibits his patience. God exhibits his long-standing willingness to work with the Jews historically, even though they continue to mess up and do things he doesn't want them to do. He respects them. He shows his patience in 3 ways. First of all, in his respect for human freedom and dignity. We've already said the Jew and the Christian and Muslim all believe God directly creates human beings in his image and likeness. And having done so, and having given them volition and freedom and free will and free choice, he respects the decisions they make. I say here that's very different from the perspectives that we've seen in East Asia, and especially with Buddhism, where there's really no self. Remember, anatta means you really don't have an individual self. Very different picture here with Judaism. You do indeed have an individual self. God made it, and he respects its decisions. I put here also, I mentioned Job, the Old Testament figure of Job in the book of Job, and I referred to this also in Paths of Return. If you've read that story, Job experiences horrific suffering. His family is killed, and all of his property is destroyed, and he's got illness and sickness, and his body is ravaged by pain. And these so-called comforters, other fellow friends come over to see him. I say so-called comforters, they really don't do him much good. I think their names are Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. And they basically say to Job, you must have done something wrong. You've done something evil. You've sinned in some way. Well, actually, the book of Job calls Job a perfectly righteous man. And Job sticks up for that reputation. He says, I don't think I've done anything wrong. I need to talk to God directly. I want an audience with God. I want to figure out what's going on and get him to explain this to me. And God honors that. At the end of the book of Job, God actually shows up. And he critiques the comforters and tells them they've basically been, saying all kinds of stupid stuff. And he honors Job by saying, okay, well, now here's what's going on. I'll explain this to you. So God is patient in that way. He's patient, exhibits his long-standing care for his people in sending them prophets. A prophet literally means someone who speaks on behalf of or for someone else. And these prophets are, as it were, PR people, if I could use that expression, public relations people for God. God sends them as his personal agents to correct the people, to chastise the people, in some cases to predict the future, and that's how we use the word prophecy often, but more often just to communicate his will and his teaching and his purpose to human beings. That's what prophets are all about for the Jew, and they have to do again with God's patience. And then finally, thirdly, God exhibits his patience in his long-term redemptive promise of sending the Jew as a kind of final victory at the end of all history, the Messiah, the Mashiach, as he's called in Hebrew. The word Messiah, as you know, translates into Greek as Christos, Christ, and Christians, of course, believe that Messiah has come and that it is Jesus Christ. The Jews don't think that, but they certainly do believe God will finally vindicate his people and redeem his people and make up for all the dumb things that they've done and honor his contract, his covenant with them in a kind of final victory at the end of time when he sends the Messiah. Telos of linear history, I say. The goal, the purpose of history itself has in a way been this final coming of the promised Messiah. Well, here are some images just to give you visual reminders of these points. I've got up on the left-hand side, there's Job and his comforters in a painting by the poet and painter William Blake. So there's Job, and then these guys we call comforters. Job's just sort of looking up at the sky going, God, get me out of here. Tell me what's going on, God. Here we've got, speaking of prophets, there's Moses, and he's raising his staff, and the Red Sea is parting to liberate the people from their bondage in Egypt in the Exodus story. And then, again, Messiah, Mashiach, the coming Messiah. This is how Mashiach looks in Hebrew, the coming Messiah. My arrow tells me, we'll go to one more screen here. Christians, again, believe that Messiah has come. Christians, a child of Judaism, the early Christians were Jews, but they believed that the messianic promise, as we call it, had in fact been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Christ, this is how Christ looks in Greek, Christos, that's how you transliterate it. There's Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, Mashiach. Christians, however, do a number on this. They say, no, Jesus was not just the Messiah, however. We believe, Christians say, that Jesus was no less than the I Am himself, incarnate as a human being. So, God says to Moses, I am that I am has sent you. If you look in the Christian Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, John records Jesus is repeatedly applying that name, I am, to himself. Most perhaps notably, startlingly, in John chapter 8, some Jewish elders have just got done saying to Jesus, hey, you're not even 50 years old yet. Who are you to tell us what's going on? Who are you to correct us and criticize us? And Jesus' reply was, before Abraham was, I am. Notice the tense switch. Past tense was. He doesn't say before Abraham was, I was, which would suggest that he's just really, really, really old. No, he takes the divine name and applies it to himself. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the one who was actually speaking to Moses on Sinai, he's saying, which is extraordinary. It's blasphemy from the point of view of the Jew. I wanted to point out here in this icon of Christ, actually we call this the nimbus around the head of Christ or around the head of a saint. Christ's nimbus is unique in having this cross in the background. And inside of the cross are the Greek letters Omicron, Omega, and Nu. And that's actually the Greek translation of the Hebrew tetragrammaton. So the one who is, the I am, in Greek it says the being one, the one who is. So Christ is believed by the Christian to be that very God incarnate. And that's, again, a total departure from what Jews, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, the whole 9 yards, none of them believe that Christ is Messiah, nor that when the Messiah does finally come, the Messiah will be God. So a pretty big difference in doctrine and dogma there. Well, my final slide here, and I'll stop here momentarily, but I wanted to, as we've moved now from east to west, to underscore some of the big differences that we've seen between these traditions, Asian religions, now today with Judaism, and going on to Islam in the West. Notice the exoteric differences, the outer differences. Whatever the inward commonalities may be, we certainly do have, and we need to admit that we've got some pretty big surface differences between these traditions and how they look at the world and God and so on. In Asia, I say God is transpersonal. In the West, he's personal. For Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus both, the world is illusory. It's Maya. In the West, it's real. It has a solidity to it. Is the world painful or is it revelatory? Here again, we've got a kind of an outward dispute between these traditions. Is suffering a problem? Well, certainly the Buddhist would say so. That's right in the heart of the Buddha's teaching, right? Suffering, everything's suffering and dukkha. Or is suffering redemptive? Is suffering actually a part of the solution to the problem? Well, that would be typical of the West, especially perhaps Jews and Christians. In Asia, time is cyclical. It comes round again, right? In the West, it's linear. In Asia, the emphasis is on being. Remember, the Taoist just says, stop doing, just be. Whereas in the West, it's on doing, action, moral action in particular, action according to what God has willed for human beings. So the question I'm leaving you with here, I want you to ponder this question. I'm not going to try to answer it myself, but just think about this. Are these exoteric differences an indication that these religions are in fact radically, even inwardly different? Or might it be possible to look at God as being both personal and transpersonal, though in different respects? Could the world be in some sense real and in some sense illusory? Could it be revelatory and painful? Could suffering be redemptive and problematic? Could time be viewed in different ways, depending on perspective and angle of vision? Could it be that we are to both do and be in some different respects? So think about that. Ponder these questions. These are the big kind of theological, philosophical issues that I want to alert you to as being really important things to contemplate as you move forward through this class, but also, I hope, into your own life after this class as well.